His death was celebrated across Russia. He was loathed by everyone, from grand dukes to the poorest peasants. His name was Grigori Rasputin, and more than a century later, we still can't seem to agree on who he actually was. You know what drives me absolutely crazy? Nearly every video about him, without fail, insists that he was the most mysterious man in all of Russian history. It's been barely over 100 years since his death, and we supposedly know less about him than we do about Caligula or Genghis Khan? Can you believe that? Let's dig in. We'll tackle a few key questions. Question 1. Who was Rasputin really? Soviet historians predictably had little interest in Rasputin. He was dismissed as a byproduct of the rotten Tsarist legacy, a colorful nobody with no historical value to speak of. As a result, solid historical scholarship on the man was virtually non-existent in the USSR. And the public made do with assorted nonsense, ranging from a holy man murdered by Freemasons to the devil incarnate who destroyed the Romanovs. I would argue that Rasputin isn't the most mysterious figure in Russian history. He's the undisputed world record holder for the sheer volume of nonsense generated about him. Western filmmakers have been particularly enthusiastic contributors to this tradition, producing movies about him so absurd you can't decide whether to laugh or cry. Take, for instance, the 1932 German masterpiece with the breathtaking title, Rasputin, Demon of Women. The Germans went out of their way to portray the Russians as complete imbeciles, which, given the year being 1932, is hardly surprising. What the film lacks in historical accuracy, it more than compensates for with sheer stupidity and various forms of indecency. The Americans were not to be outdone. That same year, they released a film with the clickbait title, Rasputin and the Empress, in which Grigori attempts to usurp Nicholas II's throne. When he isn't busy plotting political intrigue, the sinister Rasputin wanders the palace corridors in search of women to prey on. Notably, the screenwriter was nominated for an Academy Award, a vivid reminder that the Oscars have always had a soft spot for peculiar creative choices. The French film, I Killed Rasputin, is considerably less unhinged, largely because one of the actual murderers, Felix Yusupov, served as consultant and even delivered an opening statement of staggering cynicism and dubious gravitas.
Prince, au soir de votre vie, lorsque vous repensez à Rasputin, quel sentiment éprouvez-vous à son égard?
Le dégoût.
Prince, dans des circonstances identiques, si vous aviez à prendre une décision identique, referiez-vous ce que vous avez fait?
Oui.
It was a crime of passion. Leave it alone.
The absence of outright lunacy aside, the French film more than compensates with its dramatic intensity. It plays, not to put too fine a point on it, rather like a gay melodrama. This struck me as, shall we say, puzzling, until I dug a little deeper and found the following passage in the memoirs of the notoriously glamorous Felix. Rasputin moved closer and took my hand. He stroked my hand and stared intently into my eyes. Without taking his eyes off me, Rasputin ran his hand along my back, smiled slyly, and in a soft, insinuating voice, asked whether I cared for some wine. Well, moving on. Rasputin continues to inspire filmmakers to this day. In 2021, the British film The King's Man gave us a demonic Rasputin who not only brings a couple of very disreputable ladies to a royal reception, but engages in combat ballet with an attractive young man and helps himself to various improprieties along the way.
We like to fuck like tigers.
No one seemed able to stop him. They fought and fought, all for nothing, until at last a strong, independent woman swept in and rescued those poor, helpless men. Which raises a question. Why are these strong, independent women always young and beautiful? And thin? Frankly, I find this ageism and body discrimination deeply offensive. In my view, it's high time we start sending plus-size women of a certain age, yours truly included, to save humanity from evil. We're retired anyway and have the time. enough about the movies. Truth is not really their business. Let's turn to books instead. In post-Soviet Russia, Rasputinology flourished magnificently, dutifully recycling every idiotic pre-revolutionary myth in circulation. Fortunately, in 2013, a book appeared that actually cut through the fog. Rasputin, Life, Death, Mystery, by historian Daniel Kotsubinsky and his father, mental specialist Alexander Kotsubinsky. Together, they dismantled the legends with admirable thoroughness. Their first target was the legend of Rasputin's demonic gaze. Many excitable ladies insisted that Rasputin's eyes were utterly extraordinary, penetrating, infernal, impossible to hold. The impressionable Felix Yusupov agreed wholeheartedly. His gaze was sharp, heavy, and piercing. One truly felt some hidden, inhuman force within it. Less susceptible observers, however, noticed nothing of the sort. The book cites a journalist named Lvov. I searched carefully for the mysterious, enigmatic gleam so many attributed to his eyes, and found nothing. What I saw was the shrewdness and quick-wittedness of a sturdy peasant who understood his position perfectly, and had thoroughly figured out the curiosity of the gentry toward plain folk. Palace Commandant Voyakov added, "What struck me most unpleasantly were his shifty eyes, forever darting about, never meeting your gaze directly." The conclusion is plain. Different people simply perceived the same man very differently. Rasputin had a remarkable instinct for reading people. He instantly knew who could be manipulated and who could not. The Kotsubinsky book offers a thorough psychological portrait of Rasputin. It begins with a birth trauma. His mother recalled him as an extraordinarily restless infant, thrashing in his cradle and fighting his swaddling clothes. He grew into a nervous, fidgety young man. The defrocked monk Iliador, who knew Rasputin well, painted a memorable picture. He didn't so much enter the room as burst into it, with strange contortions and leaps. He seemed less like a living man than a wind-up toy whose arms, legs, and head all start jerking at once when you pull the string. Psychiatrist Kotsubinsky concluded that Rasputin showed all the hallmarks of histrionic personality disorder. People with this condition are naturally theatrical. Their entire existence is organized around being the center of attention, receiving praise, applause, and adoration. To stay in the spotlight, they manufacture scandals and shock those around them with outrageous behavior. We all know the type. Rasputin was rude and imperious with Yusupov and other high society devotees, but would immediately deflate and shrink when confronted with a genuinely strong personality. On one occasion, he made unsolicited advances toward a merchant's wife. The lady firmly rejected his attentions and, for good measure, boxed him smartly on the head, whereupon he took fright, fled, and spent considerable time afterward weeping on Iliador's shoulder. Born and raised in the village of Pokrovsky in Tobolsk province, Rasputin dazzled his fellow villagers for a time, before growing bored and setting off on a spiritual journey, leaving his wife and children behind. In 1903, he arrived in St. Petersburg. Question 2. How did he get to the imperial family? Have you ever tried becoming close friends with a head of state? How exactly did Rasputin pull it off? Partly through rare good luck, a peasant arrives in the capital at precisely the right moment. But what made the moment so right? A networking genius, Rasputin had spent his years of wandering, cultivating priests and wealthy society ladies, each recommending him to the next. Eventually, he was introduced to the aforementioned Iliador and his associates Feofan and Germagen, leading figures in the Black Hundreds, a gang of ultra-nationalist reactionaries. They saw Rasputin as the perfect opportunity to plant one of their own inside the imperial household, a useful puppet who could influence the Tsar on behalf of their obscurantist gang. The wily Rasputin soon sent Iliador and company packing and struck out on his own. The vengeful priest retaliated with a book called The Holy Devil, cataloging Rasputin's supposed depravities. Historian Alexander Bokanov, in his own book, Rasputin, Anatomy of a Myth, offers this assessment of Iliador. Reading Iliador Trufanov's book, one cannot escape the impression that the author is an unmistakably unhinged individual, consumed by erotic visions of the most extravagant variety. The early 20th century in the Russian Empire was a great age for extravagant individuals. They were sprouting up like weeds. This is invariably what happens when a country stands on the threshold of enormous upheaval. High society in St. Petersburg at the time was besotted with three things. First, mystics, hypnotists, spiritualists, prophets, and preachers of every description, including every variety of bigoted zealot. Second, as historian Bokhanov rightly notes, the capital was gripped by a kind of erotic hysteria, affecting primarily ladies who cloaked their considerable looseness in the language of spiritual seeking. Third, there was a fashionable craze for men of the people. The idea that some simple peasant in bast shoes might wander into an aristocratic drawing room and impart rustic wisdom to the gentry. Rasputin landed in perfectly prepared soil and adapted instantly. He understood perfectly what was expected of him, and duly set about playing the role of spiritual guide, sexual titan, and oracle of peasant truth, all rolled into one. He was a gifted actor. It also happened that, because the Tsarevich, the crown prince, suffered from hemophilia, the empress was perpetually in search of mystics, wandering holy men, and various miracle workers. Most of them didn't last long. The Romanovs eventually saw through them. Only Rasputin managed to become a true friend of the imperial family. The scheming Bishop Feofan believed that the Tsar had fallen under Rasputin's sway, and this is why. On one occasion, Rasputin was present at a tea party with the Romanovs. The conversation turned to politics. Then something remarkable happened. In Feofan's own words, Grigori suddenly jumped up and pounded his fist on the table, then demanded of the sovereign, "Well, where did you feel it, here or here?" Pointing first to his forehead and then to his heart. "Here, my heart leapt," replied the Tsar. "That's right," Rasputin continued. "If you're going to do things for Russia, don't consult your mind, consult your heart. The heart is more reliable than the mind." The sovereign said very well, and the empress, kissing Rasputin's hand, said, thank you, teacher." It's because of scenes like this that some people conclude Nicholas II slavishly obeyed Rasputin. Historians disagree. The Tsar agreed to rule by the heart not because some buffoonish peasant told him to, but because it was precisely what he wanted to hear. It was far more congenial than grappling with the tiresome political realities of 1905, the adoption of a constitution, unrest in the State Duma, the Russian parliament, and other tiresome distractions that kept interfering with his favorite pastimes, hunting, diary writing, and generally avoiding the responsibilities of running a crumbling empire. A consummate performer, Rasputin played the role of voice of the people and intoned exactly what his audience wished to hear. In doing so, he brought calm to an imperial family perpetually on edge. He was, in essence, their therapist. And, of course, there was the matter of his ability to help the Tsarevich Alexei during hemophilia attacks. Naturally, this gave rise to the myth of Rasputin's healing powers. But rather than indulging in anti-scientific fantasy, let us ask, how did Rasputin actually treat the Tsarevich? The answer is actually quite simple. Rasputin himself explained his method of treating hemophilia. The thing is, people whose blood flows like that are very nervous, very anxious, and to stop the bleeding, you must calm them down. It is now well established that calming a hemophilia patient through hypnosis, conversation, or simple distraction significantly improves their condition. Such methods work especially well on suggestible individuals. Children with hemophilia are also highly sensitive to their parents' emotional state, and the Empress, it must be said, was a nervous woman prone to hysteria. The charismatic and theatrical Rasputin was remarkably good at soothing both mother and child. There is nothing magical or mysterious about it. Far more interesting is the next question. Why was the poor scoundrel murdered? After arriving in the capital, Rasputin, enthusiastically talked up by his patrons, quickly became the talk of the town, a prized ornament in the drawing rooms of bored aristocratic ladies. In those early days, he behaved quite decorously. Writer Dmitry Loman testified to the investigating commission after the murder. At that time, Rasputin was beyond reproach. No drunkenness, no eccentric behavior. Like a doctor diagnosing a physical illness, Rasputin had a gift for approaching people who suffered spiritually and immediately sensing what they sought and what troubled them. His plain manner and warmth brought calm to those he spoke with. But his histrionic nature couldn't be contained for long. He began boasting openly. "I can have any minister removed just like that. I'll put in whoever I like. If I want, I'll make a mangy mutt a provincial governor." This infuriated everyone except his devotees. Rumors began circulating in the drawing rooms that Rasputin was guilty of Klisti heresy, a banned sect notorious for its orgiastic rituals. On top of that, whispers spread that he had established a den of depravity. Thus was born the legend, later immortalized by Boney M in their 1978 disco hit, of Rasputin as a love machine. But Dr. Kotyubinsky argues convincingly in his book that reality was quite the opposite. I won't dwell on the intimate details, but I can assure you that the book makes a thoroughly persuasive case that Rasputin's reputation as a sexual colossus was, shall we say, greatly exaggerated. By the early 20th century, the noose around Grigori's neck was tightening. The first to turn against him were the Black Hundreds, who resented being used as a ladder and then kicked aside. In retaliation, Phaephon, Iliador, and their allies launched a campaign against Rasputin, and the capital was soon flooded with vicious rumors. The press had a field day, churning out gossip and fabrications of all sorts. By 1910, Interior Minister Stolypin had turned against him as well, believing Rasputin was damaging the ruling dynasty. His enemies multiplied. An unlikely coalition of conservatives and liberals in Parliament united in loathing him. Church leaders also longed to be rid of him. But this was merely the prologue. The main act came with the First World War. Military setbacks enraged society, which promptly found a convenient scapegoat in the hapless rogue Rasputin. Sensing the ground shifting beneath him, he did what any true hysteric would do, took to drink, and began making a spectacle of himself. This naturally made an already dire situation considerably worse. By early 1915, the patience of the high aristocracy had run out. The murder was committed by a group acting in concert. The conspirators included Felix Yusupov, husband of Nicholas II's niece, his intimate friend Grand Duke Dmitry Romanov, the Tsar's cousin, another member of their intimate circle, Lieutenant Sergei Sukhotin, and the magnificently unhinged parliamentary deputy Vladimir Purishkevich, representing the Black Hundreds. Who exactly were these people? Felix Yusupov is the figure filmmakers invariably cast as the mastermind. He was born into an absurdly wealthy family. Curiously, the Yusupov name came not from his father but from his mother, tracing back to a certain Mirza Yusuf, who served Ivan the Terrible faithfully and received his title as reward. Felix himself claimed to be directly descended from the Prophet Muhammad, which is, to put it politely, a stretch. The Yusupov line is nonetheless considered ancient and distinguished, though cynics noted that in Ivan the Terrible's day, a princely title was essentially a reward for being in the right place at the right time. Felix's father, Count Sumarokov Elston, had the good sense to marry the sole heiress of the Yusupov line, Princess Zinaida. When a woman of princely rank marries a mere count, she always loses her higher title and takes his lower one. But wealth of sufficient magnitude is always good for an exception. Alexander III issued a decree permitting the couple to style themselves Princes Yusupov. Count Sumarokov Elston, meaning Felix's father, became simultaneously both a count and a prince. The family, as one might expect, was well acquainted with emperors. Popping in for tea with Nicholas II and his wife was an entirely ordinary occurrence for them. Felix spoke of his mother thus: "Wherever she appeared, she brought light. Her gaze radiated kindness and gentleness." It was this gentle, radiant woman who enthusiastically encouraged her son to murder Rasputin. Felix was her favorite, and when he was small, she liked dressing him in little frocks, having always wanted a daughter. From the age of 17, the beautiful Felix amused himself by dressing in women's clothes, attending balls, making the acquaintance of charming young men, one thing invariably leading to another. Rumors of the most unflattering variety circulated about him in society.
Cursed with too much money, simply an antisocial animal.
His parents, anxious to get him out of harm's way, packed him off to England, to Oxford, though he was enrolled not as a degree student, but as an occasional auditor, so as not to overstrain himself with academics. He was, after all, busy, dressing up in women's clothes and making the rounds of theaters and other establishments best left unnamed.
Oui, la chambre de pipi.
Let's look through there, but the performance is about to start.
Merci.
A charming, mildly overindulged young dilettante, eccentric but essentially harmless. On returning to Russia, Felix set his sights on marrying Princess Irina Romanova, the Tsar's niece. Her parents were unenthusiastic about the match, to say the least. Her other suitors had included Prince Christopher of Greece and the Prince of Wales, future King Edward VIII. Irina herself was extraordinarily beautiful but famously reserved, described by contemporaries as excessively shy and incapable of sustaining a coherent conversation. She was, however, stubborn as a mule, and firmly announced that she would either marry the infamous Felix or die a spinster. How could an 18-year-old resist a suitor who wrote her letters like this? Did I ever imagine that your small, inexperienced mind already harbored such settled views on life, and that you and I feel and understand life in precisely the same way? There are very few people like us in this world, and we are nearly impossible for others to comprehend. Both of us at bottom are deeply unhappy. We both believed that no one understood us, that only we felt things so keenly, and so on. A masterclass in flattering impressionable young women. Her parents relented. Felix's parents were overjoyed at the connection to the Romanovs. Nicholas II and his wife were displeased but held their peace. The marriage of an imperial princess to the fabulously wealthy but notorious Yusupov caused quite a scandal. Yet Felix and Irina were, by all accounts, genuinely happy together. In conversations with friends, he did elegantly refer to intimacy with his wife as a diet.
Kissy. Mwah.
But that was no obstacle to their happiness. They supported each other in everything, including Irina's wholehearted endorsement of her husband's plan to rid Russia of the loathsome Rasputin, who had attached himself to the imperial family like a leech. The conspiracy enjoyed wide support. Even Irina's grandmother, Nicholas II's mother, Empress Maria Fyodorovna, backed the scheme, with only the gentle request that they not make it too painful for Rasputin. What a thoughtful woman.
An incredible human being.
Felix himself remained convinced to the end that he had performed a great service to the motherland. Precisely how this changed anything, beyond plunging the already shattered empress into despair, remains unclear. After the revolution, the Yusupovs emigrated to France. Felix was proud of himself, considered himself a historical figure, and wrote a book about his exploits. Our second conspirator, Grand Duke Dmitry Romanov, Felix's very dear friend, was no less of a looker. He was the son of Grand Duke Pavel and Grand Duchess Alexandra, née Princess of Greece and Denmark. Her brother, Prince Andrew, was incidentally the father of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, who would later marry Queen Elizabeth II. His resemblance as a young man to a certain royal cousin is rather striking, but that's beside the point. Dmitry's mother died in 1891, shortly after his birth. His father sank into grief and placed the children in the care of Grand Duke Sergei Romanov and his wife, who was not exactly lavish with maternal affection. Then came 1905 and the First Russian Revolution, during which grateful subjects effectively opened hunting season on Grand Dukes. Many fell to the bombers' hands, including Sergei Romanov. His wife took the veil. Dmitry and his sister were placed in Nicholas II's household. Contemporaries described young Dmitry as good-natured but a hopeless lightweight. From an early age, he fell in with the aforementioned Felix Yusupov and ended up in a very bad crowd. They constantly shocked decent society with their antics, including some that were genuinely idiotic. From a letter Felix wrote to his mother, "If they don't find the cigarette case, we must have an investigation, because I know for certain it's in the house somewhere. Have the bathroom checked. Yesterday, Dmitry wanted to do a pee-pee in the tub again, and we had quite a row over it. The cigarette case may have fallen somewhere in the scuffle.
Pip, pip. Good Lord.
Bear in mind that this enthusiastic bathtub defiler was fifth in line to the throne. He had been raised as family by Nicholas II, and knew perfectly well what devastation Rasputin's death would bring to the Empress. After the 1917 revolution, the Grand Duke fled to France, where funds ran somewhat short. But a man of his title and appearance was not left to founder. He first came under the wing of Coco Chanel, living at her expense in her charming little villa. The romance lasted a year, after which they parted but remained friends. Dmitri was, by all accounts, a thoroughly likable man. He subsequently married an American heiress, Audrey Emery. The marriage did not last long. She may have grown weary of her husband's habit of spending her money on the monarchist youth organization, the Mladi Rossi. He died in 1942 at 50 of tuberculosis and kidney disease. Lieutenant Sergei Sukhotin, the third conspirator, was no less colorful a figure, and no less intimately connected to the others. To his credit, he was courageous. He fought bravely on the Eastern Front during the First World War, and was decorated for valor. After being wounded, he returned to Petrograd, where he duly participated in the murder of Rasputin. Unlike his co-conspirators, Sukhotin did not flee abroad after the revolution, but remained and became a Soviet official. In 1918, he was convicted of bribery and ended up in prison, where he organized a folk instrument orchestra. Upon his release, he became the director of the Tolstoy Museum and married the writer's granddaughter, Sophia. He emigrated in 1925, his health by then already in poor shape, but the ever-generous Felix Yusupov saw to his financial support. Killer number 4. Vladimir Purishkevich, a parliamentary deputy, possibly the most genuinely outrageous figure in the history of Russian politics. The early 20th century Russian parliament was already renowned for its turbulence. Deputies screamed at one another and traded threats. Not for nothing did Lenin himself dub the spectacle parliamentary idiocy. Even against this colorful backdrop, Purishkevich's star shone with a special lunacy all its own. He made a habit of hurling abuse at his opponents, calling one parliamentarian a stinker, and responding to a peasant representative's speech with, "Before him, gentlemen, we heard from princes, counts, and barons, and now we have listened to a plebeian." On one occasion, while spewing choice invective from the floor, cries rang out, "He's mad! Send for a psychiatrist!" The enraged Purishkevich flung a glass at the liberal politician Milyukov, then attempted to throw a decanter, but was restrained. He was a vile Black Hundreds militant, who called for the murder of political opponents and supported pogroms. He was also spectacularly strange and addicted to attention-seeking stunts. On one memorable occasion, to torment the leftist parties, he turned up to Parliament with a red carnation inserted in his fly.
I feel like I'm taking crazy pills!
The Russian Parliament on the eve of the First World War was genuinely entertaining. Purishkevich had the nerve to claim primacy in the anti-Rasputin conspiracy, insisting that he devised the plan, fired the fatal shot to the head, and was the whole operation's driving force.
This could be a lot more complex.
Question 6. Was British intelligence behind it all? There have long been persistent rumors that Rasputin's murder was a British intelligence operation. According to his memoirs, the British ambassador to Russia, George Buchanan, knew about the plot a week in advance. His memoirs also reveal just how much everyone knew. Writing about Nicholas II after the murder, he noted, "I heard that His Majesty suspected a young Englishman, a school friend of Prince Felix Yusupov, of complicity in the murder. I took the opportunity to assure him that the suspicion was entirely groundless." Groundless? Everyone knew perfectly well what was going on. In 2004, the British produced a documentary called Who Killed Rasputin, in which they laid out the whole truth about this school friend of Prince Felix Yusupov. His name was Oswald Rayner. He and Felix had formed a close friendship and enjoyed their time at Oxford together. Rayner was an agent of the British Secret Intelligence Bureau, the organization now known as MI6. In his memoirs, Yusupov mentions that the day after the murder they had lunch with Rayner, who supposedly only knew about the plot and came to hear how it had all gone. The documentary, however, states plainly that it was Oswald Rayner who fired the coup de grace into Rasputin's forehead. Its makers gained access to Russian archives, including forensic evidence from the Rasputin case, and concluded that Rayner was the true operational commander of this unlikely little cell. And frankly, I believe them, because it is difficult to imagine that such luminous figures as Yusupov, Purishkevich, and Grand Duke Dmitri could have managed something like this on their own. One rather detects the firm hand of the British Empire at work.
I'm reminded of the virtues of the English.
The British wanted Rasputin removed because he might persuade the Tsar to make peace with Germany. As for the stated objectives of Yusupov, Purishkevich, Sukhotin, and Dmitry Romanov, they were somewhat vaguer. The plan, apparently, was that eliminating Rasputin would galvanize the great families of the nobility into action. They would confront the ineffectual Tsar and either persuade him to send the meddlesome empress to a convent and govern properly himself, or abdicate in favor of his brother.
That's a great plan.
The great plan did not work. Playing political games is somewhat more demanding than strolling around Parliament with a carnation in your fly. Nobody rose up, nobody deposed anyone, and the Empress was not dispatched to a convent. 2 months later, the February Revolution arrived, followed by the October Revolution, and the Tsar was disposed of anyway. Despite the police identifying the killers almost immediately, Rayner conveniently excluded, none of them faced any consequences, for the perfectly logical reason that half the conspirators were closely connected to the Romanovs.
Because we're a family?
Yes, that's right.
After the revolution, Yusupov fled to France. Rasputin's daughter, Matryona, emigrated too. After Felix published his memoirs, she sued him, seeking substantial damages for the murder of her father. The French court dismissed the case. Felix, for his part, bore Matryona no ill will and always spoke of her kindly. Naturally, his aristocratic upbringing precluded him from speaking poorly of a lady. It was quite another matter to help murder a defenseless man. Having failed to extract money from her father's killer, Matryona was not about to give up. She was nothing if not resourceful. She worked as a governess, a cabaret dancer, and eventually a tiger tamer. A theatrical nature. Just like her father's,